Thank you so much. I'm very fortunate that this is my second opportunity to speak at this research conference. I was really blown away at the first one. I think I was here in 2012. In fact, I'll talk a little bit about an area of research that I learned about from this conference, Felix Warnekin's research. And it's a really remarkable opportunity to bring rigorous basic science to an incredibly important topic with real-world implications and an intervention that not only works, but it has really good science, and increasingly good science backing it up that I know you'll hear more about in the next hour. So I'm going to just jump right in and talk about this issue about gender, because especially when it comes to empathy and interpersonal relationships, there are a lot of bad rumors out there that ultimately I think are a disservice to males, but may misrepresent females inappropriately too. And so I'd like to show you the real data. You know, we're in an era of a lot of fake news, and unfortunately, even in science, little bits of bad science get a lot of propaganda. And so my goal is always to amass the most data I can and look at it rationally and present things as they really are, which is usually a little bit complicated, but I think we can nonetheless take home some very useful messages from this. So when it comes to the topic of gender, we have a very strong attitude in our society, in most societies, that there's such a thing as a hardwired brain difference. And this idea really goes all the way back to Aristotle. And every time there's a new area of science, whether it was anatomy in the 1800s, or genetics, or more recently neuroscience, my own field, which has really only been around since about the early 80s, we have a new scientific rationale, essentially, for sexism, racism, et cetera. So this idea of a brain sex, that book actually was published in the 80s, but you can go to the bookstore, if we still go to bookstores, or search on Amazon, and you'll find a whole shelf full of topics like why men don't listen and women can't read maps, why men want sex and women need love. I mean, there's just endless numbers of these that try to take a little bit of neuroscience and turn it into a complete Mars-Venus dichotomy, and that really is the granddaddy of them all. I'm going to talk about the work I'm going to refer to the work of another author, Luann Brizendine, who is a psychiatrist and really should know better, but has written a couple of books that sold quite well. I think The Male Brain was published in 2010, but really presents this dogma that most people believe and puts scientific credentials on it, I think with a very careless use of the data. So, for example, she writes in The Female Brain, her book, The Female Brain, the female brain has tremendous unique aptitudes, outstanding verbal agility, the ability to connect deeply in friendship, and a nearly psychic capacity to read faces and tone of voice for emotions and states of mind, and the ability to diffuse conflict. All of this is hardwired into the brains of women. These are the talents women are born with that many men, frankly, are not. So I underline the word hardwired, but it really doesn't matter where you put the emphasis here. It's pretty shocking to suggest that women have the ability to diffuse conflict and men are frankly born without that ability. I mean, come on. We might as well give up the Middle East peace talks. We might as well close down the UN. And it's just kind of funny how you can write this kind of stereotyped sexism in a favorable view about women, but if you were to do something comparable, elevating men's psychic capacity for leadership and scientific analysis, you know, it would be totally banned. But this is where we are today. We really are. There is an enormous amount of sexism when it comes to interpreting brain science, and I want to help you cut through that. So just to take up on this idea of this women's supposedly hardwired, innate ability to diffuse conflict, I have some data from a large study actually done in Canada of children's tendency towards physical aggression. So it may or may not surprise you. I think if you work with young children, it probably won't surprise you that girls in the dark bars and boys, when they're 2 years of age, are pretty darn likely to hit, bite, or kick another child. And so we're all a little bit selfish by nature at birth. Children have to learn. We civilize them. They have to learn to a large degree their pro-social skills. And so what we see is that really everybody learns not to be aggressive. Girls maybe learn a little more quickly than boys. So by the beginning of kindergarten, girls are about half as likely as boys to physically aggress. But if that doesn't illustrate the different messaging that we send our children, I don't know what does. I mean, you tell all children, use your words, don't hit, and then you turn on the TV on Sunday, and what are you watching but, well, football games where men are rewarded enormously for hitting and smashing each other. So boys get a very conflicted message, but they do learn. Most boys do learn. So much for the hardwired ability to diffuse conflict. But it's even worse than that. And what really troubles me is when this leaches into our teachers. So several authors, I'm only highlighting a couple here, but there's a whole cottage industry, brain sex industry of teacher educators going into professional development sessions and explaining to teachers these supposed hardwired differences between boys and girls and why boys are wired to run around, they can't sit still, they can't pay attention, and they have trouble learning language. Gurian says they're about a year behind boys in learning language, which is completely untrue. Leonard Sachs is another one who's used claims about hardwired differences to rationalize gender segregation and different methods for teaching math to boys and girls. And they basically just use bad science. I'll show you later that Leonard Sachs's quote about emotion being processed by different areas of the brain in males than females is just utter nonsense and horribly extrapolated from a little study. But it has big impact on our society. These books are read by teachers and lots of parents, and it just reinforces some, I think, very harmful attitudes and practices. So if we're going to talk about gender differences, we have to talk about the real data. It's not a matter of boys and girls are either identical or they're opposite. No, there are differences. Of course, we're all aware of the differences, but it's a quantitative issue, and I hope you'll agree that it's much more a difference in degree than in kind. So when psychologists or neurobiologists talk about group differences, we use a statistic called a D value, which is really, I promise, pretty simple. All it is you take two measures of groups of people. So here we have male and female height, which we all know men are taller than women. It's about 5-inch difference. And if you measure the height of a large number of men, a large number of women, you can plot these curves, and you see the bell curves are separate. There's a little bit of overlap. And this is what we would call a very large difference, okay? This 5-inch difference between men and women. And the way you calculate this D statistic, this difference statistic, is you just subtract the mean height of one group from the mean height of the other group, and you divide it by the standard deviation, which is a measure of how spread out the bell curve is. And so we say that males are about 2 standard deviations taller than women, and that is an enormous sex difference, okay? This is one of our biggest sex differences. And note that it's a physical trait. When we talk about mental traits, psychological traits, the sex differences are much, much smaller, and most importantly, they're rarely present in children. They're much more often present in adults. So, for example, verbal fluency, the ability females on average can articulate more words per minute than males can. But if we measure verbal fluency in large groups of males and females, we see, I hope you'll agree, a difference, but it's a very small difference. There's much more overlap than separation between males and females, and this difference is about on the order of 1/3 of a standard deviation. And the reason I chose that was because there was a large study done by Janet Hyde at the University of Wisconsin some years ago now, where she pulled together every study that had ever been done on sex differences, gender differences, and she wasn't just looking at raw data, she was looking at meta-analyses, which is when you pull together every study that's been done, and these can involve thousands of individuals, and try to find an average effect size across all the studies. And when she did that, she found that the vast majority, about 78%, of our sex differences, and these can range from things like verbal ability, math ability, leadership traits, empathy, aggression. Most of these differences are on the order of 0.35 or smaller. These are what we call small sex differences. There's only a handful of things where males and females differ by more than these bell curves. And so rather than Mars and Venus, some people say a better characterization of male-female differences would be that men are from North Dakota and women are from South Dakota. Or Janet's analysis was followed up fairly recently by a virtually identical study, because there's more data that have accumulated since 2005, and a group of scholars from several universities did the same meta-synthesis on gender similarities and differences and found pretty much the same result, that the vast majority, now we're up to about 85% of our trait differences differ by less than a 0.35 standard deviation, whereas there's a handful of things that do differ. And in this paper, so it was a great validation of Janet's study, and note that we're up to 386 meta-analyses. So this is now we're involving millions of participants. And they note that although most gender differences are small, there are a few areas in adults where the differences are moderate to large. And these include, for males tend to score higher on masculinity. So if we give somebody a survey of traits that are associated with masculinity, they score higher. No big surprise there. Mental rotation ability, which I'm not going to talk about today. Importance of physical attractiveness in mate selection, and aggression. And I'm highlighting the ones that have something to do with social emotional development. Females score higher on measures of reactivity to pain, peer attachment, and interest in people as opposed to things. So some of these effects are out on the large size between 0.5 and 1.0 standard deviation. So I've highlighted the ones that have to do with relational traits. What about empathy specifically? So the dominant view is that females are hardwired for empathy and not males. And this was stated just bluntly by Simon Baron-Cohen, who is a prominent psychologist researcher at the University of Cambridge in England. He wrote a book in 2003, I believe it was, called The Essential Difference, where he said, the female brain is predominantly hardwired for empathy. The male brain is predominantly hardwired for understanding and building systems. So a pretty bold statement, and he admitted it was, but he tried to back it up. Frankly, he didn't back it up with a single bit of brain evidence. It was mostly psychology. It was mostly studies based on empathy. And unfortunately, a lot of his measures of empathy are subjective empathy that ask you, how do you feel, when you see about cutting up worms, and how do you feel about violent movies? And not surprisingly, when we're asked subjectively, our responses, men and women, kind of exaggerate our differences because we're socialized for different things. If you ask people objectively, that is, if you flash a bunch of pictures on a computer screen with facial expressions, and you're asked to say, is that person happy or sad, angry? It turns out men and women are much more similar in our abilities to measure facial expressions. So a meta-analysis done by Aaron McClure looking at empathy differences across the lifespan. So again, meta-analysis, this is combining all of the studies, at least that had been done up to the year 2000 on sex difference, found just a moderate-sized sex difference in adult, a 0.4, and much smaller in children, okay? So that's the key point. If women and men are socialized differently to be sensitive to other people, then we would expect that this emerges gradually through development. And this is exactly what we see. And so that's really the take-home message of my book and the take-home message of my talk today, that small differences grow into troublesome gaps. I'm not saying boys and girls are absolutely identical from birth. Of course they're not. We have different chromosomes. We have different hormonal exposures before birth. But everything in the literature that I've read and studied tells me that these differences are just a little tipping point. And then what happens after birth is that we treat boys and girls differently. They play different games. They, most importantly, associate with different peers. And those differences, just like we learn everything else from our culture and our peers, exaggerate and we ramp out of control. It's like throwing a wedge like throwing an axe in a tree and forcing the tree to divide in two different directions. The differences are subtle, but we very much exaggerate them. So for the rest of the talk, I want to focus specifically on gender differences in social emotional, or rather social relational development, because that is really at the core of empathy and the Roots of Empathy program. So you heard a little bit about this yesterday from Dan Siegel, and this idea that we're increasingly appreciating that our brains are evolved specifically for a social purpose. So the mammalian brain has become very exaggerated in size compared to our pre-mammalian ancestors, and particularly in the primate family. And the idea is that we evolved to handle these computational demands, that social groups are much more complicated than, early neurobiology was focused on cognition and how do we do math and how do we do language. But it turns out that a social environment is so much more complex, and we'll see. You use a huge portion of your brain to do that. And I'll talk about mirror neurons, which you heard a little bit too, that seem to be put in place for very rapid social learning. And just in general, across the mammalian line, there's pretty good evidence that empathy is present in most of our mammalian ancestors, and so leading up to the human brain development. This just gives you a feeling. We talked about some rat brains yesterday, Bart. These are a little bit out of scale, but the point of showing this is, you see these colored areas are the more primitive sensory and motor parts of the brain that control touch and vision and movement, and they take up a much larger proportion in rodents and cats than they do in us. But what has changed dramatically are the uncolored parts of the brain, what we call the association cortex, is just dramatically expanded. And it turns out that almost all of these areas in the frontal lobe, in the parietal lobe, and in the temporal lobe, these uncolored or heteromodal areas of the cortex, are actually play a key role in our social interactions. Social interactions are so complicated, we use an enormous part of our brains for that purpose. And this just illustrates some of the areas that Dan was showing you yesterday with your brain models in your hand. Maybe that's probably a better three-dimensional thing you can carry around, but just if you wanted to put that on top of a real brain structure, you can see many, many areas of our frontal, parietal, temporal lobes that are dedicated to face processing, social processing, intention processing, gaze processing, things that are required to interact and astutely judge another person's motivations. Now, the key thing about brain development is that none of these cortical areas are up and running at birth. Our cerebral cortex is largely unconnected at birth. The neurons are there, but they haven't put out their branches, their dendrites and axons that allow them to turn on the circuits, essentially. And everything we've learned about cortical development demonstrates that it depends on experience, that wiring up our cortex depends on what you're doing with your time from the moment of birth. So babies are seeing the world, and that visual experience is actually the key factor that wires up the visual cortex to see edges and colors and shapes and identify faces. And everything tells us that the rest of the cortex develops similarly. It absolutely depends on experience. Now, what we are born with at birth is a subcortical limbic structure. So limbic is the part of the brain that controls our social and emotional life. And it literally means the border, because it sits at the boundary between the instinctive, the brainstem parts of your brain, and then the higher, the thinking, the more learning-dependent parts of our brain. And so at birth, we know that babies can recognize faces, but they're not using their cortex to do that. They're using their amygdala and a sort of a rapid projection from the eyes to the thalamus to the amygdala. And it's only with this experience that Jude is getting better and better at recognizing faces, recognizing emotional expression, recognizing intention, that these cortical areas wire up. And so some of the limbic cortical areas are illustrated here, like the orbitofrontal cortex. Others of them, as I showed you on the previous slide, are in these uncolored parts of the brain. These areas develop through relationships and social interaction. There's been just an explosion of research. I should tell you that the field of social neuroscience didn't even really exist maybe 15 years ago. I mean, a few people were working on social emotional, but the field has really flipped from the cognitive side, from figuring out how we process shapes and words, to very much to the social emotional side and understanding, because of our appreciation of how much of the brain is dedicated to this. And so there's no question, and some of these studies do go back decades, that babies are born with a social instinct. No matter what the modality, they prefer the social version to the non-social. They prefer the human face to any other stimulus, the human voice to any other auditory stimulus. They make eye contact from birth. Imitation begins at birth, which was kind of a surprise. In the old Piaget days, he thought imitation didn't even begin until about 10 months of age. Depends what you're measuring, as always. And we even see that a child's basic understanding of the give and take of a conversation is present as early as a couple months of age. We call this Proto Conversation. So this was a study with the monkey that showed sort of the evolutionary roots of our face preference. Primate societies are every bit as complex and require identification of other individuals. And so it turns out that monkeys too prefer faces instinctively. And to demonstrate this, they raised this monkey and a cohort of monkeys with no exposure to faces for the first couple of months. So they were nurtured, but they just didn't see faces. And yet these infant monkeys preferred to look at faces. Now, they couldn't distinguish different faces, either monkey or human, but they showed a preference for anything with two eyes and a mouth compared to a non-social stimulus. So there is something, and as I said, we think this is all processed subcortically, going straight to the subcortical limbic system, where the cortex part is going to take its time to develop, where we get our more subtle understanding of emotional expression and individual faces. But this pre-wiring, this instinctive attention towards social stimuli is what drives a baby's interest toward his or her caregivers, because as we heard yesterday, we also are an allo-parenting species. It's the rare child that's only nurtured by a single adult. And initiates this intersubjective dyadic sharing that is just the core of what it means to be human and to even develop consciousness. So just to highlight some of these findings about early development, we now know that facial imitation begins at birth. These were several different groups back in the 80s did some carefully controlled studies where a model would demonstrate certain facial expressions, and then the baby's face was recorded, and it was found to be statistically more reliable that the infant would mimic whether the model was pouting or smiling. We know this also happens for vocal expression. Babies begin vocalizing vowel sounds about 2 or 3 months of age, and you can see that if a model repeats a certain vowel sound, the baby's likelier to reproduce that vowel sound in little interval shortly thereafter. So this is obviously an extremely, extremely powerful mode of learning, imitation. We know it begins in our primate ancestors. We monkey other people's expressions. And there's evidence that it's even more powerful in children than adults, that as we get older, we tend to imitate less. Not surprisingly, we develop our individuality. But it may be wired into us. And there's even some fascinating artificial intelligence, machine models of learning, where you can program into a computer a rudimentary sensory and motor ability and actually teach the artificial brain to behave and think based on just imitating a live human. So there's been tremendous, when we talk about social emotional development, most of the funding for this research comes from people who are trying to understand autism, of course, and because it's such a widely prevalent disorder in young children. And perhaps not surprisingly, there's longstanding evidence that the ability to imitate is impaired in children who are diagnosed with autism. And so that obviously is going to be a key feature in some of their later challenges. You heard yesterday about mirror neurons. This was another big discovery now almost 20 years ago. And it was made quite fortuitously by researchers who were trying to study the role of motor planning neurons, initially in the frontal lobe. I had electrodes in monkey brains and walked into the lab, and the task was the monkey was supposed to pick up a cup, and just the researchers picking up the cup to get ready for the experiment, the same neurons fired when the researcher picked up the cup as they were expecting to fire, and they found to fire when the monkey picked up the cup. And so this idea that we have processing in our brain that is equally responsive to our own behavior and the behavior of a species mate doing the same activity tells us how socially wired we are. And it's not just movements. It turns out this works for language. When you're watching somebody speak, the same parts of your brain are activated as when you're speaking yourself. And it works for empathy, as I'll show you. When you are exposed to a painful stimulus, there are certain parts of your brain that are active, and if you watch somebody else in pain, same parts of your brain are active. So it seems that a lot of our cortex, this socially evolved or socially influenced part of the brain, is set to be a mirror of our social group. Again, some evidence that mirror processing is impaired in autism, although that is somewhat controversial. So in addition to just the raw preference for social stimuli, there's also evidence that infants are particularly sensitive to the emotions of other people. So babies will smile, vocalize, imitate, adjust their gaze, much more when facing a person than an object. And even by a couple months of age, infants are expecting people, but not objects, to share the same emotional states. The purpose of emotion is to relate to other people. We express emotions as a way of communication. If we lived in a vat, there would be no reason to smile or cry or frown. And that infants' attention is very much tipped toward engaging with other people who are emotionally expressive, that they are wired to prefer a who versus interacting with an it. So a little bit of research is demonstrating this begins in the cortex, although, as I said, for the most part, this initial processing at the subcortical level, there's a relatively new method called NIRS, where we can, this looks pretty horrible, but it's completely non-invasive. This is a very young infant, a couple of days old, where you can actually measure brain activity using light. So it helps that infant skulls are still a little bit thinner, but there's nothing invasive. There's just a band around the head, and these electrodes are capable of measuring subtle differences in reflectance of the skull, which are associated with brain activity under the surface. You can't measure the whole brain. Obviously, you can't go to deep structures, but you can measure the surface structures of the brain. And so work by Teresa Ferroni in Italy and London has shown that infants have a stronger brain activation to a moving social stimulus than to a moving inanimate stimulus. And it's pretty fuzzy in terms of locating exactly which part. We just know it's in the posterior part of the brain, the more sensory part of the brain at this stage. But it's nonetheless indicating of where that activity is going that infants are experiencing early on, and it's this activity that is putting the circuits together. So the circuits aren't there really for discriminating faces and emotional expression. Babies prefer any face to a non-face, but telling the difference between mom and dad and sister, or the difference between happy and sad and surprised, all of that is going to depend on this experience. And so it's this early activity getting into the cortex that's wiring up those circuits. The last feature of early social instinct is the fact that babies are very programmed to pay attention to other people's intentions. And so we know that any kind of perspective taking is critical for social communication. I mean, that's really where our bonds are coming from. And I think Dan made a pretty persuasive case yesterday that this kind of perspective taking is even the basis of our own self-awareness, that it's through mirroring other people's motivations and intentions that one becomes aware that you're a person at all and that your thoughts may be different from another's. So as early as 3 months of age, babies respond to joint attention, which is if you're carrying a child around and you say, oh, look over there, as you know, the baby will divert his or her attention to what you're focusing on. Incredibly powerful method of training or teaching a child. And then by 5 months of age, we see that babies are initiating this themselves. So the baby has figured out that if they look at something, then the caregiver or the older sibling will look at that as well and talk about it and explain it, maybe walk over there, hand it to the child. So that's pretty strong communication at 5 months about what you want to explore in your environment. And show me this thing before a child can even utter a single word. Often they're not even babbling in consonants at this age. By 12 months of age, actually babies begin pointing before 12 months of age, but a study by Legersty found that infants will use pointing. They understand the purpose of pointing is social engagement. They're only going to use pointing in this study to direct the attention of a person, not a stuffed animal. Even though a stuffed animal has a face and everything, they get the idea that this is an inanimate object that doesn't have intentions. So that's a pretty sophisticated understanding by just 12 months that other people can have interests and that you can both pay attention to what they're interested in as well as redirect their attention to teach you more about your environment. So all of this is challenging the idea that infants don't have a theory of mind, that infants don't get the idea that you're a person who's different from me, who may have different thoughts. And so, although classically this ability was said to not begin until about age 4, there's no question that in this first year of life, infants already understand a tremendous amount about other people's emotions and intentions. And so here we get to the research that was first introduced to me at Roots of Empathy, which is the work of Felix Warneken and Michael Tomasello, and the idea that it's not just our social abilities, but actually our pro-social bias. That is, that we are more inclined to want to do good in the world than bad, that has its very early roots. We know from studies, a lot of work from Karen Wynn, some from Paul Bloom, Hamlin, that infants as young as 3 months of age show a preference for others who are engaged in positive as opposed to negative social behavior. So I have an illustration of that study here. We've got a baby at 3 months, and they did this study at 3 and 5 months, is looking at these puppets, and there's this yellow puppet who's trying to open this box, and then the blue puppet comes along, and he or she is helping the yellow puppet open the box, but then in a later part of the the puppet show. These were live puppet shows, they weren't videos. There's a green character who comes along, and he's the hinderer. He's pushing down on the box, and so the yellow guy isn't able to get it open. So the baby's riveted watching these puppets trying to open this box. And guess what happens? When they then give the child a choice of the blue puppet or the green puppet to touch and to pay attention to, most of the children preferred the helper puppet and not the green guy, the hinderer puppet. And then they had some inanimate controls. These were figures that didn't have anything face-like on them. So there does seem to be, early on, maybe through 3 months of having somebody help you as an infant, a preference for those who are helping as opposed to hindering others. We also know that infants will, even without any coaxing, without any parental encouragement, help another person who seems to be struggling if the child has that capability. And they will do this without any reward. In fact, rewards, if you overly praise or even offer tokens to young children specifically for helping, you can somewhat undermine this ability. Just let the child observe pro-social behavior, and they will produce pro-social behavior. And then the last piece of this with the moral development that is much more rapid evolution than, or more rapid maturation than the classic textbooks are telling us, is that 3-year-old children think it's wrong to violate a moral convention, something like hitting, even in situations where experimentals will manipulate things and try to tell them it's okay. So they've really internalized a sense of right and wrong already from 3 years of age. With all this evidence of infants' social bias, with their social attention, with their attunement to other people's attention, and with their pro-social instinct, that is to help others when possible, at such a young age, you'll notice that I didn't show any gender data on that. And if we were to listen to Luann Brizendine and Leonard Sachs and Michael Gurian, we'd probably think that, well, girls must be much better at this than boys, or this must start quite early. And it turns out that there's really very little evidence for that. So this notion that there's an innate difference in social connection, as Luann would put it, anyone who's raised boys and girls or watched them grow up see that they develop differently. Especially baby girls will connect emotionally in ways that baby boys don't. And when I first read that, I just thought, my God, that is about as subversive as you can get. We do know boys and girls diverge in their development, and we have some empathy differences by much later in childhood, but telling parents not to even expect their sons to connect is only going to reinforce a bad trend. This one study seems to be their only real source of evidence. It was published many years ago now, out of Simon Baron-Cohen's lab. So remember, he's the one that wrote this book, The Essential Difference, this notion that females are hardwired for empathy and males are hardwired for system building, which is, as I said, science. And so I just wanted to tell you some of the details about this study, which has been so widely, and Gurian cites it, Leonard Sachs cites it. So what they did was, the lead author, Jennifer Connellan, went into a hospital in probably Cambridge, where the university is, and they recruited 100 parents with newborn babies, 50 boys and 50 girls, to do this test of social attention. And they didn't do it. There were 2 stimuli. One stimulus was Jennifer's actual face. She stood in front of the bassinet and measured, and then there were video cameras focused on the eyes to measure the amount of visual attention that the baby was looking right at her face. And then The second part of the experiment, and I think they randomized the order between different infants, was to look at this crazy mobile, which was a photograph of her face cut up and scrambled so that it doesn't look like a face. We know it's not the preferred stimulus, a face stimulus. And then they stuck a little ball on it. So they called it a mobile. But anyway, but it was dangly and it was moving. And then they tested the boys and the girls, and they found that there was a difference in the amount of time the girls looked at the faces versus the amount of time the boys looked at the faces. Pretty small difference, right? But then they looked at the amount of time the boys looked at the mobile versus the girls, and they saw a little bit bigger difference. And then they statistically combined these. That allowed them to come up with a pretty large difference between boys' attention to mobiles and girls' attention to faces. And then they concluded that boys are wired to look at objects and girls have an innate preference to look at faces. Well, there's a lot of problems with this experiment, not the least which, and it's been critiqued by many, our lead author was not always blind to the gender of the babies. If it's one thing we know about studying sex differences in children, our knowledge of whether somebody is a boy or a girl, our knowledge of whether someone's a man or a woman influences the way that we interact and we judge them. And so we don't know what cues she may have been giving off for the face, attention to the faces. I wrote Baron Cohen some years ago. I said, why don't you repeat this with computer images or photographs or something where you don't have a live person trying to potentially make eye contact.
What did he say?
He said, oh, that's a good point. Yeah, we haven't gotten around to that. I mean, this was like 12 years after the study was published, right? However, there's been loads of other infancy research, and so I'll just point out a couple of other studies and then tell you that I'm actually working with my students to do a meta-analysis on all the infancy studies, newborn attention to social or face-type stimuli. So here's a study that tracked, I think it was about 80 children, half boys and half girls, studying at visit 1, which was in the newborn period, the second day after birth, and then revisiting the same infants 4 months later that measured eye contact. In this case, the person making the eye contact was actually blind to the infant's gender. The babies were dressed in white. The room was cleared, or they brought them to a special room. And then tried to make eye contact over a 6-minute period and clicked a clicker every time they were looking at the eyes and then away, and found that at birth there is no difference in eye contact between boy and girl infants and an adult experimenter. However, 4 months later, we see that girls are making more eye contact than boys. So that's actually a pretty big developmental change, and it turned out that most of this difference was fueled by the female experimenters. So half the experimenters were male and half the experimenters were female, and between birth and 4 months of age, girls start paying more attention to women's faces than men's faces. And we know among adults that women make more eye contact than men do, and women especially make more eye contact with other women than they do with men. So something in our culture, in our social development, tells us that maybe women feel safer, or they've learned to promote their own bonding through this. But anyway, infants seem to be learning this cultural difference, if you will, in just 4 months of age. So then here's some other studies that may go against the Simon Baron-Cohen finding. Other studies that have looked at object versus face preference. Here we're at 4 months of age, when you would have expected more social learning, where you would have expected boys had more opportunity than they did at birth to show a preference for faces over objects. And so we had both live faces and dolls, real cars, pictures of real cars and toy cars, and we see both, whenever there's a choice between a face and an object, both boys and girls are preferring the face to the object at 4 months of age. So face preference is very, very strong, and this doesn't surprise me that boys would be more interested in faces. And this was a true choice experiment, whereas the other experiment with the Jennifer Connellan's study was done first the face and then the mobile. They tried to present it as a preference, but you can only say it's a preference if you give two choices and the infant actually looks at one or the other. And that's how this study was done. And it turns out that there's been many studies over the years. It's been looked at for so long, we can go back 40 years to a pretty seminal book on the psychology of sex differences. At that date, there had been 4 studies of young infants asking whether boys or girls showed greater fixation to social stimuli. And it turns out in 3 of the 4, the boys were showing the greater fixation. So you can never trust a single study. You need to really pull the data together, and that's what I'm doing with my students right now. We're reviewing the literature, trying to do a comprehensive review to find any study that's looked at social perception, whether it's gaze, preference, reaching behavior, imitation, vocalization, and then looking in that data for boys and girls. And the key thing about this is when you're doing a meta-analysis of sex difference, you've got to be careful to avoid only finding studies that have the title sex difference in their title, because there's a publication bias, so that if you study, most people try to include males and females in their studies, and if they happen to find a difference between boys and girls, bingo, they get another publication with the title sex difference, gender difference. If they don't find a difference, unfortunately, they often don't report it at all. If we're lucky, they'll report the data for boys and girls separately, and then they'll say, P greater than 0.05, there was no difference. So that's what we're looking through the literature to find every social study and then look at the data for the boys and the girls. And in many instances, the researchers don't report it, so we're exhaustively contacting authors for their raw data. So hopefully in a year from now, I'll let you know the results. But my hypothesis is that there, at least in early life, 0 to 3 or 4 months, there's not a difference in social preference between boys and girls. Nonetheless, we have a mechanism for it, even a mechanism for this supposed sex difference. Of course, it's testosterone. So I just want to show you a little data on that. So Brizendine declares quite definitively, girls do not experience the testosterone surge that shrinks the centers for communication, observation, and processing of emotion. Yikes, baby boys are exposed to pretty high levels of testosterone before birth. That is what masculinizes their bodies. Up to about 7 weeks in utero, you can't tell the difference. Actually, until about 12 weeks in utero, there's not much difference between boys and girls. But the surge of testosterone begins about 7 weeks, and that's what masculinizes the genitalia. And we believe it has effects on the brain. There are certain behavioral, perhaps activity level may be influenced subtly by this prenatal. But certainly when it comes to emotion and communication, there is very little evidence that testosterone influences this, although she was pretty definitive. So I'll show you 3 studies that I'm aware of. One which found they're measuring testosterone at birth, or in these young infants, and then comparing their EEG measures to language processing. So again, this is non-invasive. You can just put little scalp electrodes on and measure the baby's brain's responses to speech sounds, and they found that they just divided the boys into high testosterone and low testosterone. They probably tried to do a correlation, but they didn't find anything linear, so they took the high testosterone boys and the low testosterone boys, and then they looked at their measures of lateralization, that is left versus right processing. And most of you probably have heard that we process language more with our left hemisphere. So if somebody suffers a stroke in the left hemisphere, they're likely to lose language than the right hemisphere. But this develops gradually. Children are less lateralized early on. So more lateralization is a sign of greater verbal maturity. And this suggested that males with lower testosterone were more verbally mature. But then we have another study done about a year later that's now we're seeing all the data for the boys and the girls. Girls are in white, boys are in black, so girls have lower levels of testosterone. We don't have zero testosterone, but girls have lower levels of testosterone than boys. And in this case, it was the reverse. So the higher levels of testosterone are associated with higher lateralization, with stronger left hemisphere. So exactly the opposite finding. And then we have a study, believe it or not, that Baron Cohen is an author on, although I note he's not the senior author. Mark Johnson is somebody who studied infant face perception for decades. They were looking at lateralization, so left-right activation, and they found that fetal testosterone measured by amniocentesis did not account for any of the variability in lateralization. So this is an idea that a lot of neuroscientists are still kicking around, that testosterone somehow affects our left-right dominance. And you know, thus far, the studies in young infants absolutely do not support that hypothesis. There's a whole other piece to this, as we know, that language learning is not just about waiting for your brains to wire up under the influence of testosterone or not. So there are certainly many influences on our speaking abilities that are a function of learning. And I know this is familiar to many of you, that basically the idea that language exposure produces greater vocabularies. The actual difference between boys and girls in speech skills is about a month. So this is a large study comparing toddlers at different ages. A boy's vocabulary is about the size of a girl's vocabulary who's 1 month older, and the actual effect size across many cultures is quite small. But interestingly, studies that have looked at parent interaction with children are finding that already in the second year of life, mothers are talking more to daughters than sons, and also reading more. Parents actually read more to their daughters than their sons. We may not be aware of it, but daughters and firstborn children get read to more often. There are so many studies of the brain, huge studies of men and women's brains, to a lesser extent of children's brains. If you do a large enough study, you're going to find a difference between men and women. And this is probably one of the biggest studies, 1,400 men and women. We see certain areas of the brain that are pink and blue, which in this case refers to this connectome, how highly connected one part of the brain is to others. And so these pink areas are more connected in females, blue in males. But look at the distribution. Again, we come back to the idea that these are statistical differences. It's not an opposite. And we overlap much, much more than we differ. And interestingly, that same connectome measure done now in children, now granted this is not 1,400 people, but they were able to find no sex-related differences in this DTI, this measure of connectivity, starting at birth and going through adolescence. So, you know, perhaps if we had 1,000 boys and girls, we'd pick out something subtle. But the point is, it is extremely subtle, and it probably emerges through development. Because here we have a larger study of 300 adolescents. It was the same measure of connectome, and there was no difference in the adolescents. So it's very likely that when we see a sex difference in the brain, it's not just a matter of testosterone or hardwiring, okay? Yes, the brain is biological, but biology and hardwiring are different things. If you take anything home from this talk, I hope it's that. So I have a little thought experiment to get this point across. Imagine 2 subjects in a brain scanner, and they're asked to do a moral reasoning task, a judgment of whether somebody is morally right or wrong. And you see a strong activation in subject X in this medial prefrontal, a tiny little blip on the frontal pole in subject Y. And of course, I labeled them X and Y to mislead you that this was a man and a woman and a man, when in fact, these were 2 individuals from the same society of the same gender. One was raised as a Christian, one was raised as a non-believer. So anytime you see a gender difference in the brain, you really have to ask yourself, is it a matter of wiring, or is it a matter of learning and culture? I hope you come away with this idea that there's really no such thing as gender-neutral parenting. And I skipped over the slide to show you about this family I think they're in Ottawa, with a baby named Storm. Does this ring a bell to anybody? I'll see if we can find that slide during the Q&A, but they are probably the closest thing we've seen to a gender-neutral rearing. They don't send their kids to school. They unschool them. They have 3 children. You know, one is trans, one identifies as a they, one identifies as a she, but doesn't, you know, has sort of a mix of traditional clothes of a she or a he. But for the most part, all the rest of us are chained to our gender labels. And so as much as we would like to be gender-neutral parents, it's just impossible, or teachers or mentors. Even rats, as it turns out, lick and groom their males and females differently, which we know affects the way their limbic system wires up. And if you missed this in the New York Times a couple years ago, you can just mine everybody's Google searches. What are parents interested in when they're Googling questions about their sons and their daughters? Well, it turns out with millions of Google searches, we know that parents are likelier to ask about their boys' intelligence, whether smart or stupid, and their boys' leadership. Whereas, of course, when it comes to females, we're much more interested in their beauty. And they're like 2.5 times likelier, or twice as likely to ask if our daughter is fat than if our son is fat. And so we see this everywhere in our kids' environments. I love this one, getting your daughter into science and math with a toy calculator. So I just want to leave you with this idea to think about the fact that we learn from our social partners, okay? And early on, that's a parent, maybe some siblings, but very quickly it becomes the environment or the school environment. And as soon as you get a group of 20 kids together, they will start to segregate by gender. If you have a neighborhood play group with half a dozen kids, the boys and the girls interact pretty well. In a family with mixed siblings, they interact pretty well. But once you get a large enough group, the boys and the girls segregate. And they reinforce the subtlest features of behavior, from language to interpersonal skills to interests and even cognitive abilities. So we know that even language, subtle differences in pronunciation are emerging by just 7 years of age between boys and girls as a function of their separate play. There's some nice research at Arizona State University where they've studied gender development for a long time and are actually trying to apply this understanding of segregation and differentiation to come up with some interventions for teachers to deliberately encourage boys and girls to interact. They have a buddy time in preschool, so every day you team up with your buddy, and they don't tell the kids that your buddy is a child of the other gender, but it allows them to cross these lines in a way that they don't necessarily get to do. So there's a few people that are starting to think about this. Hilary Manister did her PhD at Arizona State. So I'm just going to end then with, hopefully I've convinced you that there is no such thing as a categorically male brain and a female brain. There's much, much more overlap. Even the studies of transgender people are finding it's a spectrum. And every one of us is somewhere on that spectrum, but most of us are kind of in the middle. These differences are categorical, and I would view, in the case of relational and communicative skills, largely shaped by our learning and experience. So keep in mind the effects of gender separation and the distinctions, and I think that they're generally much more harmful than beneficial, especially for promoting a more harmonious society. So thank you so much. I hope I have a little bit of time for questions.